Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Emmy Allison, an impact advisor at Lift Economy. Welcome, Emmy.
Hi.
And our guest today is Brigitta Nemes. Brigitta is a sustainability expert with over 15 years of experience in sustainability integration, from standards to corporate social responsibility. She has worked extensively on sustainable supply chains, starting her career as a supply chain sustainability certification standard. She then applied her expertise at Danone, one of the largest food companies in the world, where she focused on integrating sustainability into their operations and into their supply chain management of third-party manufacturers. Following this, Brigitta joined B Lab, where she played a pivotal role in developing the new environmental and governance standards. Brigitta, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. So some interesting stuff in your bio. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you first got interested in the work you're doing today?
Absolutely. So it goes back to 2008, 2009, when I was finishing my master's studies. I was studying marketing in Amsterdam, and I was looking for some meaningful internship. And that's how I ended up with a sustainability certification standard, the UTZ certification, which since then merged with the Rainforest Alliance certification. So this standard was about coffee, cocoa, tea, hazelnuts, and basically it opened the world to me into sustainable development. I learned a lot about challenges in the global south, that it be gender equality, child labor, forced labor, but also environmental issues like climate change, because already back then, like 15 years ago, many of the farms in the global south were already experiencing the negative impacts of climate change. So because of that, I also was facing the issue of injustices as well, right? Because the majority of the issue regarding the climate crisis that we have today is not because of the impact of the global south, but more the global north. The global south was experiencing the issues. So yeah, it was kind of like an eye-opening experience for me. And then I also decided to dive more into sustainable development. So I did a master's study on that as well, just to have the educational background. And then shortly after, I joined Danone, the sustainability team of their specialized nutrition division. And there, I just learned a lot more about the practicalities of like sustainability, environmental issues for a large and complex company in terms of its value chains, but also if you look at the impact of their factories, for instance. And there, I learned about the B Corp movement more because Danone was also going through the certification.
What year was this around for you?
I joined Danone around 2016, I believe. And then I was getting more involved into their B Corp journey in 2020-ish. And then 2021, actually, there was this opportunity within B Lab where they were looking for someone to lead the development of their new standards, the environmental and governance standards. And I felt this, let's say, gravitation toward this opportunity. And that's how I ended up with B Lab. So it was a bit of like a natural journey. At least that's how it looks to me.
Yeah. Excellent. And so why don't we get into this topic today, which is, part of the new standards and the ESG topic. So maybe what is ESG and what is it in a nutshell, just so we can set the stage for folks?
Yeah, so ESG, the abbreviation, because of course we like abbreviations, it stands for Environmental Stewardship and Circularity. It's one of the 7 impact topics of the new B Lab standard. And yeah, what is it in a nutshell? I'm glad you asked because now with the new standards, they really provide a clear definition of what it means to be a B Corp. They really serve as a roadmap for leadership on social and environmental issues, right? So that was the whole intent, to make it clear what the B Corp certification means. And in terms of the topic itself, we know now today that it's a business imperative, that businesses understand their impact and take action to minimize their negative impact, because businesses, communities, and economies, they really rely on healthy ecosystems to function. And we are interdependent, right? So I think that's basically like a shift in narrative that we need to have. So that's also the reason why there is a dedicated topic for environmental stewardship, to kind of like shift this narrative that it should be a must for all businesses to think about their environmental impact and to address it. And in a way, this also aligns with key frameworks. I can talk to that in more detail as well, and also with upcoming regulation. In terms of its structure, maybe just to share that as well, it aligns with the key actions of impact management, in that companies first need to identify and assess their impact, set targets, implement, monitor, learn, and adapt. So this is like the circle of impact management that we are also emphasizing with the structure of the requirements.
I really appreciate using the term stewardship in this topic, because I think it really demonstrates that we are all stewarding this planet together. And I think it sort of removes a little bit of the ownership sort of language that comes sort of prepackaged with capitalism. I really appreciate the topic. And I think also the emphasis on circularity is really exciting in general. Could you share, Brigitta, a behind the scenes moment during the development of these new ESG standards, perhaps a deeper debate or a breakthrough idea that really shifted the team's thinking?
Thanks for the question. Well, maybe just to emphasize that it was a 4-year process, right? And 26,000 pieces of feedback. It was a lot to go through, but also an immense amount of insights that we gathered through the 2 public consultations, right? In terms of challenge, I would say that probably what the standards team was really trying to get right is ensuring the right requirements, right rigor of requirements for the right size of companies as well. Because this is in a way like a unique standard that it applies to all size of companies and all sectors. So this kind of like accessibility globally, how to make sure that we can do that it makes sense and it's meaningful for the different types of companies that are part of our community. In particular for the environmental stewardship and circularity topic, what was also like very influential that during the development phase of the standards was when the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted in 2022. So what the Paris Agreement for Climate, like the global goal for biodiversity, this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that framework was also very influential in the standards, because that requires or asks companies, all businesses, to understand, assess their impact and take action, so that it's not, let's say, a voluntary approach that companies understand their impact in their operations and value chain, but it really stresses that, because that's the only way how companies can really set meaningful targets, right? So that's why it's also one of the core requirements of the ESG topic, this assessment of their actual and potential environmental impacts. It reflects the global goal. Yeah, it gives just more imperative for companies.
The environmental stewardship and circularity standards require companies to monitor specific aspects like waste and energy and water use. In version 6, these elements were awarded points, but they weren't required. How is this new ESG impact topic different from the previous versions of the B Corp standards, especially regarding how it challenges businesses?
Yes, so indeed, there will be numerous aspects that may be familiar for B Corps, because it really builds on the solid foundations of the previous versions of the standards, like topics that companies might be already familiar with, like energy or waste tracking, water measurement, this type of metrics. But also in the previous standards, there were some practices around supplier engagement. And these are also elements that appear in the new standards. But now, of course, it's not a voluntary, but these are mandatory requirements, right? So there's the shift, but then also we have introduced more guidance and criteria around these requirements and also extended. So for instance, now, as mentioned before, it's mandatory for businesses to assess and identify their actual and potential environmental impacts, because that basically helps set up businesses to define meaningful targets to minimize their impact in their operations and value chain. So this is mandatory, and to have a strategy around that. There is also more emphasis on supply chain due diligence, right? To understand more the impacts of a company's supply chain, let it be high-risk raw materials. So those raw materials that could be linked to severe environmental damage, for instance, excessive water use or toxic pollution, deforestation, or ecosystem conversion. So larger companies need to have an actual traceability roadmap to make sure that they understand the origin of these high-risk commodities, but then also mitigate any environmental impact that they discover. So that's also a key piece here. And for small companies, this is also like right-sized, this supply chain due diligence. So for them, it's more around how they can consider the environmental impact in their procurement decisions, right? Then there are also other aspects that the new impact topic puts more emphasis on, for instance, circularity and the hierarchy of actions within circular economy. So moving away just from considering circularity as equal with recycling, but like how can we actually incentivize companies that they consider the hierarchy of actions as well? And then new requirements were introduced for the service sector with minor footprint, because these companies where their biggest environmental impact is likely with their clients and projects. So that's why there is a new requirement for certain industries in this sector that asks them to assess the actual and potential environmental impact of working with specific clients and projects, and then have a mitigation action in place. And that's also the same for certain industries in the financial sector as well, so that they need to look at their investments and assess the actual and potential negative impacts, and then have some mitigation measures in place. So these are, in a way, like new areas that were brought in to make sure that the different sectors of companies act on their impact where it's really material and where it really matters. So that's why for service with minor footprint, it would be really the clients and projects.
Thanks, Brigitta. One thing that's coming up for me around this conversation is the challenge of creating a standard that's rigorous and compliance, like allows you to meet and is interoperable with all these other standards, right? Like the UN or GRI. And yet B Corp certification has historically tried to, I don't know if they've ever explicitly said this, but maybe it's more of a feeling of like, we're not GRI, because it's like just compliance focused only with like, and there's not like that vibrant community, or maybe there is a vibrant GRI community that I don't know about. Maybe that's, and so I guess, you don't have to have the answer for this, but how do we, with these new standards, maybe not get locked into the, like, okay, this is just all, like, basically the whole B Corp movement is now shifted towards like a GRI model where it's just like, you just have to meet all these minimum requirements. And how do we like retain some of that entrepreneurial like excitement about like different options? And maybe it's more like you don't have to have the answer, but was that discussed like in the creation of the standards? Like, how do we balance those two things to like create something rigorous, but also not, taking away from that B Corp sort of spirit?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I think maybe how a company should look at it, that, there is still a difference between reporting and disclosure standards and the performance standard, right? So B Corp is a performance standard, but it also may support companies with their reporting obligations as well, right? Because the data that they prepare for the B Corp certification or vice versa, those could actually support each other. So that's why when developing the standards, there was focus on creating this interoperability to ease the documentation. So that's one aspect, because harmonizing the language and interoperability is key, because there are so many different types of standards out there. So we also wanted to help companies. So that's why there is this interoperability section. But that's one aspect. It is great because it increases transparency, but it doesn't necessarily help stakeholders understand the company's performance. It is just purely about disclosure, because it doesn't put things into perspective. So with the B Corp standards, we try to support that continuous improvement of companies, that they need to implement certain practices as well. So they need to measure their, I'm just taking an example of this impact topic, they need to measure their water waste energy. And that's also something that maybe they would also disclose for other reporting standards as well. But it doesn't stop there, because we do ask them that they have to have a rigorous process in place to understand how those metrics of their operations interact with the nature, with the environment that their operations are in, and define then a strategy based on that, right? And then also that there is mandatory supply chain engagement as well, so that it really helps companies with the practices, that it doesn't just stop at strategy level, but that we actually, with the standards, we help focus companies' attention on actual practices that can help them progress with their strategy. So I hope that gives a little bit of an answer to your question around the difference, that it's not only about collecting data, but it's also about the practices that the companies implement over time with continuous improvement, demonstrating that they are moving towards a specific goal. So that's how I would summarize it, specifically focusing on the ESG impact topic. Because I can also go broader, but then of course would bring in other topics like collective action, or the purpose and stakeholder governance, which touch a lot of different areas that reporting standards usually don't cover.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I appreciate your answer and sort of differentiating performance versus disclosure certifications, but it's got me thinking too that like the previous versions of the B Corp standards did allow for a little bit more innovation, I think inherently in the flexibility, but I think we're giving up a little bit of that for that clarity that you're speaking to. It will be so much clearer to all stakeholders what precisely a B Corp is or what a B Corp is not. And I appreciate the sort of line there, but I also think that there's so much of our community that lies in the actual community like gatherings. Like there's just like a whole separate aspect of the B Corp movement that we're very intentional in our gatherings, and we gather at multiple levels and online and offline. And I think there's like an offline element of the B Corp community that you can't really capture in the standards influence, but I do think it's still up to us to be fostering and facilitating this community that you speak of, Ryan.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to something really, really important, because eventually I think collective action and fostering this like shared learning will be crucial when companies are working on implementing or meeting the requirements of the standards, because there are some topics that may be novel or maybe very challenging. So in order to actually meet and progress, companies do need to collaborate more and share and exchange. So this type of community learning will be probably even more important in the future.
Yeah, thanks. One other question that's coming up for me is around just the idea of circularity for companies. For better or worse, the majority of the B Corp community is still small service companies, right? Like, at least I think so. You could tell me otherwise, but I'm pretty sure it's more than 50%. And so the concept of circularity, at least to some of the companies that I've spoken with, strikes a little fear and concern of like, what does that mean? And, I think circularity for, medium to large manufacturing, there are a lot more requirements in this topic, and we'll get into those. I'd be curious for your thoughts on the smaller, micro, small, or medium companies who maybe have some manufacturing, but they use co-manufacturers, like it's not in their own supply chain, or it's not their own owned facilities, or they're just a service company that, does like a lawyer or a consultant. And there's concern of like, does this mean like I have to buy or does this mean my product has to be completely circular and I'm like taking back the product and like turning it into compost for my garden? I think people get a little bit like overwhelmed because honestly, most people haven't read the standards because it's pretty dense. So maybe and we can get into the actual requirements for each in a minute, but just, do you have any thoughts, just sort of calming thoughts for those companies who are concerned about the concept of circularity and this, like, what this topic might be requiring of them? So to help, like, sort of us breathe more naturally and then maybe absorb the information a little more clearly. I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, but.
No. And I appreciate the feedback and the questions. And of course, it may seem daunting first, the amount of information within this impact topic or in general in the new standards. But maybe to break it down, for circularity, it really means that we are trying to promote systems thinking over just simple solutions, right? So, and in a step-by-step approach. Maybe just going back to the earlier point that I mentioned, that for some companies still today, recycling equates with circular economy, right? So it's often like overemphasized or used as like a catch-all solution. But like recycling typically requires energy, there could be inefficiencies in the system, and it doesn't necessarily keep materials in circulation at their highest value. So what we try to do with this sub-requirement is to help companies to think beyond the end-of-life solutions and redesign systems to prevent waste in the first place. So this is what it's all about. How can the company reduce pressure on the natural resources? And within the sub-requirement, there are 4 different options. And we ask companies to look at these options and over time move up the hierarchy, because we kind of like set a kind of like a hierarchy of options for them. And it's at their own pace, like how they are progressing. But how they need to look at it, that this is about how can they reduce the pressure and minimize waste when they are thinking about developing their products. But it doesn't mean that from today on, they have to have a fully closed loop. No, that's not about that. It's about step-by-step progress and helping, like guiding them in terms of like what could be the hierarchy of options, like what is it that is maybe a better option for their type of product, how they can evaluate that.
Yeah, maybe we can workshop with my wife, because she really loves these like LaCroix sparkling waters that are in cans. And she's like, they're aluminum though, they go in the recycling. But I was like, hey, I had this interview and it's not as high on the circularity like hierarchy, just to do recycling. So I'll take something back from this. Thanks, Brigitta.
Yeah, maybe you can introduce also like a soda stream, like a machine at home as well. And then sometimes she can have, of course, the can that she really enjoys, but kind of like mixing it up. And that's already better.
Let's go into this. Let's just dive into soda streams and stuff, Emmy. I'm just kidding. But yeah, I think Emmy, thank you for that. I think Emmy's going to take us into some of the standards so we can get into some of that.
Yeah. One of the aspects that you've mentioned in this impact topic is the shift to a mandatory assessment of material environmental impacts across operations and value chains. This is ESC 1.7. What does material mean in this context, and why was it so critical to make this shift from a previous voluntary approach? And this is a lot of questions in one. And how does it enable companies to focus their efforts where it matters most?
Yeah, so this is one of the core, like the foundational requirements of this impact topic. And it really reflects B Lab's recognition that credible leadership requires companies not only to do good, but also to manage and reduce the harm that they may cause, right? Because today there are multiple environmental crises and the ecosystems are reaching tipping points. There are like 1 million species that are on the brink of extinction, but we keep introducing novel entities like microplastics, pesticides, nuclear waste into the environment, and further exacerbating the climate crisis as well. So this requirement is really like a fundamental to respond to the environmental crises and the ecosystem tipping points that we are soon reaching. So it's a response to these, because maybe it's also different difference between climate and biodiversity, that unlike climate, biodiversity can actually bounce back in a relatively short time if given a chance. So that's also a reason for companies to act now and understand and assess their actual and potential environmental impacts. Beyond environmental reasons, there are also financial, regulatory, or reputational reasons as well. So everything is really moving into that direction, that companies should take this as something that they really have to act on, understanding their material impacts. Now, when we are referring to the word material, this is about impact materiality. So you may have heard financial or double materiality. Like financial is like how certain impacts impact the company's finances. But for our standards, we are looking at the impact materiality, meaning the company's impact on the environment. So in that sense, material environmental impacts are those that are really severe in the company's operations or value chain. So yeah, these are significant impacts, and companies can use the frameworks from other standards as well in terms of like defining what is material. Usually how it's defined is based on significance, like severity of the impact, but also likelihood in terms of potential impact. So we are also aligning or harmonizing our language with other standards that talk about impact materiality. And that's basically how it's framed. So it's really about ensuring that no major issues are ignored in the company's operations and value chain.
Yeah. And getting alignment on significant new requirements can be challenging for any organization. What would you say was the most challenging part of getting alignment on this standard internally at B Lab or with stakeholders throughout the consultation process?
Probably time was the most challenging. I mean, it took 4 years, right? And 2 public consultations. So a lot of exchanges with different types of stakeholders. But eventually, what was great that all stakeholders aligned that we need to raise the bar and that this is not going to be just a small update, but it's a complete evolution of the standards. So having that support from the different stakeholders, yeah, that was crucial and also gave energy to the team to make this shift.
You know, one of the things that the new standards introduces is new requirement for the service sector with a minor footprint. What specific environmental impacts are these companies asked to assess in relation to potential, clients they might have or projects to meet ESG 2.6?
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, this is a new requirement for this sector. And what we ask is that they assess the actual and potential environmental impacts related to the clients that they take on or the projects, and also to have mitigation actions in place in case it's not necessary. So if they find out that there could be some potential impact, negative environmental impacts, how are they going to mitigate that impact? So they should have a process in place for that.
And yeah, could you give an example of like what's a potential negative environmental impact, advising, advertising or marketing or a software company might need to assess?
Yes. So for instance, regarding advertising, a potential negative impact may be if the company, through its advertising or marketing services, like supports the overconsumption or unsustainable use of materials. For instance, if the marketing agency supports a fast fashion company to sell more clothes, now there could be obviously some negative environmental impacts. So this agency may consider to investigate more the environmental practices of this fashion brand to see if they actually have assessed their environmental impacts and they have a strategy to address potential negative impacts, let it be in their value chain, but also regarding consumption as well. But also thinking about what is the type of advertisement that they would support. Is it about buying more and more and changing your wardrobe every season? Or is it more around conscious consumption in general? And maybe it's about supporting a recycling program of the brand. So there could be different ways how companies can mitigate the potential negative impact. And you also asked about the software company. So that's slightly different type of negative impact that could lead to if they work on certain project. For instance, they may not realize, but they could indirectly contribute to like a significant data center energy consumption, for instance. What they could do then is maybe they could introduce a feature that optimizes the energy consumption of that software, or that they introduce a feature that can actually help the company, the client, to track their footprint, their environmental footprint. Or the company can also decide to only work with clients who have a rigorous environmental strategy and already low environmental impact. So there are different ways how the company can mitigate its impact regarding the clients and projects that they take on.
Brigitta, would you say, is there a part of the environmental stewardship and circularity standard that you are especially proud of, and why?
Actually, the fact that there is a dedicated topic to environmental stewardship and circularity, I'm already very, very happy about that, because with the climate crisis intensifying and the ecosystem reaching critical tipping points, businesses now really must shift how they interact with nature and really understand the interdependencies. So the fact that we have a dedicated topic for environmental stewardship and circularity, and there are mandatory actions for companies, I'm really glad about that we could reach this alignment. As mentioned earlier, maybe the one that's really the core and central requirement is the assessing the company's actual and potential environmental impacts, the ESC 1.7.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you speak to a little bit why the ESC, so environmental stewardship and circularity, is separate from the climate action topic? I think some folks might have grouped those together.
Yes, so those topics are definitely linked, right? But what we see is that there is different level of maturity. Regarding climate, the Paris Agreement has been already there for some time, and many companies already have a GHG inventory measurement in place, have targets. Maybe not necessarily all companies have science-based targets, but this is more known, and there are maybe a bit more tools and resources available for climate action. Now, for other topics, this is not necessarily the case. Like I mentioned earlier, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was set in 2022. So it's relatively recent compared to the Paris Climate Agreement. So that means that for many companies, this is still a novel subject, biodiversity and like other nature impacts other than their climate impact. And also it may also feel a bit more challenging, not just because of its novelty, but also because it really requires like context-based solutions. So it's very like your company's impact on biodiversity, water, it's really local and context specific as well. So there is just a different level of maturity. And due to the fact that the climate topic has already been out there, and there has been a global goal for some time, and companies have already been interacting with it, there's more maturity. So that's why, for that reason, we also kept it separate in a way to reflect how regulations and conventions, keeping it separate. But of course, we understand that it's a little bit an artificial separation, because these are interconnected topics, and you cannot reach one global goal without working on the other as well, because climate and biodiversity are interlinked. And we also reference that in numerous places in the standards under the climate action impact topic, but also under the environmental stewardship and circularity impact topic as well. We are making these connections, just to emphasize that these topics are interconnected.
Yeah, I think, Amy, you had a good point around which questions are applicable to which companies. So we may have buried the lead a little bit here deep into the episode, but I think, just for small service companies with minor environmental footprint, there's only a couple questions in this entire topic that apply to you. So for example, we spoke about ESC 2.6, which the company assesses the potential negative environmental impacts related to potential organizational clients and projects and takes necessary mitigation action. That's one. Another one, which I'm not sure if we talked about, and if not, maybe we should, Brigitta, which is the company considers actual and potential environmental impacts in its procurement decisions. Did we talk about that already? I don't think we did. Maybe tangentially.
Not in detail.
Not in detail.
Not in detail.
And then the third one that stands out is the company assesses the potential negative environmental impacts of investments and takes necessary mitigation actions. There's also one on animal welfare that just won't apply to many companies. And so I guess for those listeners who are like, oh, deforestation, free traceability, supply chain, like, my head's going to explode. That's not what's necessarily required of you if you're a small service company. There are a couple more if you're, for example, like if you're small, but you're wholesale retail, you have to monitor energy, water, and waste, but that's, and the product has to incorporate some circularity principles. There are additional requirements. I want to reassure listeners that some of the things we're talking about are not necessarily applicable to your size company, and to just make sure that you check, log into the platform, B Impact, the beep, as Emmy and I joked about in the first one, the Impact platform, and check to see which standards apply to you. There's a place to click on, like, check out the new standards and view which ones are applicable. So that's just a tip for anyone listening to not freak out too much about, deep biodiversity transition plans or like these other bigger things, because those are not necessarily applicable to your size company. Is there anything that you want to say to that, Brigitta?
No, you're absolutely right. Of course, that was also the intent, to make sure that we develop standards that are meaningful for that type of company, right? Because our community is very broad. So that's why we try to right size the requirements, but also look at the sector impact as well in a way. So it's very important that companies don't get scared first, but they go into the platform, as you mentioned, and filter for their size and for their sector to see the requirements that apply to them.
Okay. Well, what about this procurement decisions one? Because I think some people listening may be a little worried, like, oh no, like, what does this mean? So maybe you could help clarify what that means for folks.
Yes. So here again, don't be scared.
This is all psychology for listeners.
Yes. Here we again try to differentiate between smaller and larger companies. Like for larger companies, the emphasis is really on like having regular engagement with their suppliers and working on the traceability. Now, for smaller companies, we do not expect that, but they can consider the environmental impacts of their procurement decisions in different ways. For instance, they can choose to procure locally. They can choose to procure from suppliers that have sustainability standards, even B Corp as well, but it could be also others, right? They can also choose to, if they have some formal relationships with their suppliers, they can also choose to just inquire information. What is the environmental strategy if the supplier has? What are the main impacts? Do they even have any environmental management system in place? Just to inquire information. But that's like more if the company has any formal relationship, right? But for any other, it's really thinking about what could be the environmental impact of the decision itself if I work with the existing supplier versus maybe I can have less environmental impact if it's a local supplier. Just thinking about the context of the company, and they don't need to have a formal strategy in place or like agreeing on joint targets with their suppliers. That's not the intent for the small companies. It's looking at within their means, within their limited leverage, what is it that they can do?
Yeah. And I think, it gets in a little bit to this question. Like I looked at the compliance criteria for 5.1. Yes, for small companies, it says, consider the actual and potential environmental impacts for the 3 most material procurement decisions in the 12 months before year 0 and each subsequent year. So it's only 3. It's actually 3. So it's not even all decisions. How do you balance this challenge of, let's say a company's like, we purchased from Amazon and we considered purchasing from others, but we couldn't really find a supplier that really fit what we wanted. And so we stuck with Amazon. Like, how does that fit into the assessment? Like, they're not actually making a decision or to change, even though they considered it. How do you balance that challenge?
Yeah, so I think it's really about the company going through this due process, like this due diligence, like having some kind of process in place so that they can demonstrate that they looked at what are their options and where there could be a negative impact. So for instance, if they are procuring from a large online retail platform, which may or may not have a good environmental reputation, then they can do their research and investigate, is this really true? What is the information available that I have about that retail platform? And if the company feels that, yes, there could be some risks, maybe that's also a potential option for collaboration with peers and opening up this question, this challenge to the peers in the community. I need XYZ material, and within my reach, I'm only aware of this one particular large online retail platform, which may have questionable environmental management in place. So what would others advise, for instance, as well? So you can also reach out to your peers. There are different ways how a company can mitigate its environmental impact, but they can also have a strategy that may be, okay, not now, but we know this is an impact. So we are going to address it. We are going to prepare that in the coming 3 years, we are going to find an alternative. We have already identified it. So this is going to be our mitigation action.
Yeah. And I think you're in a tough bind as the standards creator, because you don't want to say, evaluate your 3 most material and, you have to make a choice to now go with 100% fair trade, supplier, or 100% organic, because it's not really respecting the choice of the company to do the best thing for their own business in the moment, but you are encouraging them to consider those things. And I think what I know is true is that when companies actually take the time to have the process, the due diligence of looking at those things, actually, do we really need to be purchasing from Amazon? I like how you didn't actually use their name, like a large retailer who may or may not have. You're very diplomatic. Thank you. But I think once companies can do that due diligence, a lot of them will be like, actually, we could switch, to this other supplier. And so, but it gives them the freedom to make that choice as opposed to being demanded by B Lab. So, yeah.
Exactly. It goes back to their own responsibility, like taking action for their own impact. It just goes back to what is it that they can do today to make sure that maybe not immediately, but step by step, they're going to move to the right direction.
This brings a magnifying glass to the assurance model. And I think the assurance model, it sounds like more and more is going to be more like checking a company's process than, well, maybe there's a balance. There's a balance of the assurance model, the verification process, checking a company's process for how they came to a decision or how they made a decision. And then there's also some opportunities to check whether the company actually did it. But maybe we can't speak to the assurance model quite yet.
Yeah, you're right. The assurance model is still under development. So this is something that in the coming months, once it's being concluded, it will be shared publicly as well. But currently, this is still something that's not being concluded yet. What's certain that the certification is going to move to third-party verification model, but the actual details of it, that's still being concluded at this moment.
During the entire development process of the new standards, did anything unexpected happen that maybe changed your perspective or the direction of certain aspects of the ESG topic?
I think it was just great to see the global consultation confirmed that there is an appetite for increasing the requirements, raising the bar for companies. There was an appetite for that due to several different reasons, mainly linked to the current environmental crisis, but also even given maybe the current, I would say, increasing pressure on companies to scale back on their environmental commitments. Do you feel that the B Corp standards can really be there for companies to guide them and share their continued commitment? Because that's what was clear from the public consultation, that companies do expect that the bar should be higher given the stakes that we have today.
I find that Really interesting. Would you say there was a significant change from the first consultation to the second consultation and versus like the finalized standards?
In terms of response from the community, it was, I would say, like no major changes in their answers. No.
And then I'm also curious if you and other like impact topic leads, it sounds like there's like very different challenges in coming to the finalized standards. There were several changes that other impact topics had to make and lots of roadblocks that they encountered, but it sounds like for the most part, it was pretty right sized. And if not, like it's possible that you were raising the bar by the time the final standards came out for environmental stewardship and circularity.
I think compared to the very first draft that was launched years ago for the first public consultation, the feedback that we received really helps to actually not toning it back per se, but to make sure that it raises the bar, but not too high.
Right.
Because, of course, we are facing a very challenging environmental situation today. But if you set the bar too high, that can also maybe be like contradicting to what you want to achieve, because if companies find it too challenging, then they might turn away and they may feel that it's not possible to contribute to positive or systemic change because it's just too difficult. So, and of course, this new impact topic is still challenging, right? But we hope that with time, as companies getting more familiar with it, especially with areas that are maybe new for them, there will be this fostering of shared learning, collaboration that will enable them to make that jump, that adjustment in the way how they operate or how they work with their suppliers or in their procurement decisions, and that it's going to become the norm, right? So that maybe they feel that it's maybe a bit challenging today, but that we at least give them this tool, this new standard to understand where is it that they can head towards. And we allow this, or the standards allow this continuous improvement, which is emphasized even within many of the sub-requirements, but then often by the introduction of year 3 or year 5 sub-requirements as well. So that will help companies to eventually progress and basically alleviate any concern that they may have today if they have some aspects.
Yeah, that makes sense. Earlier in the episode, you were speaking to the difference between climate and biodiversity, which is something that I just learned. Are there any other common misunderstandings in the ESG standard that you'd like to clarify for companies or the general public?
Yeah, I think we also touched this, that some companies may think that this impact topic is only for the high impact sectors, but that's not true, because companies in all sectors may contribute to negative environmental impact. So we even mentioned the service sector with minor footprint, like the example of the advertising company as well. So all companies should take action, just making sure that it's relevant, meaningful for their context. So that's what we try to incorporate by having different types of requirements for different size and different sector of companies. So that's one. The other one that we have also touched is circularity, and if recycling is enough to meet the circularity requirements. So I also mentioned there that we are really trying to emphasize the hierarchy of actions and the system thinking approach. Companies should focus on eliminating waste and reducing the pressure on natural resources. So that should be the guiding principle in their product development. And maybe about the traceability part, that again, some companies may think that it's only relevant for certain sectors, that maybe for like agriculture or the apparel industry. But of course, it could be relevant for all sectors, because any company can have impact within their supply chain if they source any high risk raw materials. So traceability and understanding the origin and the supply chain practices can be relevant for all companies.
You know, one thing about this is imagining what a future state might look like. So maybe it's 5 or 10 years, or, let's imagine the B Corp community has adopted this environmental stewardship and circularity standards. What do you hope has changed? Like, what would that look like for you?
Oh, I'm really excited just to even think about that, like what potential change the community could drive. Like imagine 10,000 B Corps modeling a new economic paradigm and that they are influencing a broader landscape, contributing to systemic change, and really demonstrating that stakeholder governance is a viable option. I think that I would be really excited to see that at a large scale in like 5 or 10 years.
I agree. I think that's one thing in the impact movement. We've tried to do a little bit with our company at Lift Economy, with our Next Economy Now podcast, et cetera, is like, what does the future state really look like? So it's really appealing to people as opposed to just, here's all the things you have to sacrifice or something, you know? So yeah, thank you for that. What do you need right now? And how can listeners help support your work or the work of B Lab in advancing these new standards?
I would actually encourage everyone to challenge the conventional thinking and really just be involved in the conversation of what a truly sustainable or regenerative business looks like. Asking the questions that like you asked from me as well, just to have conversation, an ongoing conversation about sustainable business and what we can reach if we embrace this narrative shift. Of course, I also invite everyone to explore the new B Corp standards as well. So just getting familiar with it. They are available on our website. You can also download it, but companies can also just go to the platform and filter, play around with it. I hope that it will bring some enthusiasm once companies really start to understand the details and maybe identify potential collective actions that they can do locally to support each other in like sharing learnings or challenges and identify solutions.
And, one of the questions that we can wrap on is like, what does it look like for evolving these standards? And are you looking for feedback, or can people, I think there's some ways in the B Impact platform to sort of give feedback. What would you say to people who are like wanting to engage in this ongoing process?
Yes, so indeed, there is a feature in the B Impact platform where companies or stakeholders, anyone can leave feedback. There is also formally stakeholders can raise any questions through our website as well. There should be contact details. And moving forward, just like before, the standards are going to be continuously reviewed, revised, updated. Like such major changes that happened between the previous and the new standards likely won't happen in a very short time, but as part of the like a regular standards revision process, this is something that's going to continue in the future as well. The standards from the initial start of the B Corp certification have been updated already numerous times, so that's going to continue as well in the future. So as companies interact with the standards, as the first companies are going through certification, there will be more learnings as well. Yeah, we will collect those information, of course, and when there is the next moment of a standard revision process, likely there will be, again, a public consultation. But since the standards are relatively fresh, a major revision process anytime soon is not expected. There will be likely some potential minor updates as everything is new now, right? So the standards, the platform, the assurance model. So there's going to be likely some updates, but this is something that we will inform the community in due time. But until then, if there is any feedback, stakeholders, companies can use the features in the platform, but also the contact forms on our website as well.
Excellent. Well, Brigitta, thank you so much for coming on and for the 4 years of behind the scenes work that you did on these standards. That's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess when you started, did you already have your first child or did you start?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So you're raising 3 kids, basically 2 kids and 1 standards kid.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks a lot for your really thoughtful questions as well. And I hope to engage with the community more in different ways. It's also very insightful and valuable for me and for the standards team to meet and talk to the B Corp community. So hope to be able to continue to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brigitta.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.